I'd like to welcome everyone to our Sunday morning Bible study. Bobby is out of town and asked me to take his lesson for him. We are studying from the book of Mark, and we're going to continue in that study this morning. A couple of months ago, I watched a rerun of the Dick Cavett show. For those under 50, he was a guy that was had brought people in and would interview them and those kind of things. His guest that night was Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, I've known who this person was for most of my life. Martin Luther King is pretty much everybody knows who he is. I've heard his speeches. I've seen different news clips of him, but I've never really seen him in this kind of a setting. And as I watched this interview, I was astonished at how well versed he was on a wide range of subjects, not just civil rights, but a lot of different things. The Vietnam War, our relations with other countries, and a lot of different things. And I was pretty impressed by how many different things that he was very well. He had a good understanding of all these different subjects, and also his humility as he was going through this interview. He actually looked like the last thing he wanted to do was be interviewed as he was going through it. But when I came away from this thing, as if I was looking at a person that I'd seen before, but I had a better understanding. I had a deeper appreciation for who this person was and what he did. When Jesus finished teaching in the synagogue, as he began his ministry, Mark 1:21, it says they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes taught. And as you go through this book, you notice that people were surprised. They were astonished so often at the things that he had and done and did in their presence. It was unexpected. They expected something more like what they had seen before, but this was different. Again, this quarter we're studying from the book of Mark. It's we're looking at it from a topical standpoint rather than going from verse by verse study. And this week we're going to look at three topics from the book of Mark. We're going to start with spreading the gospel, the kingdom, and the parables of the Olivet Discourse. And actually, it goes as the kingdom is the first one, and then we're going to go to spreading the gospel, and then the parable of the Olivet Discourse. Before we get started, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for another Lord's Day that you've given us, so we might come together and worship you. Father, thank you for your word that teaches us your will for us. Not only that, but that if we follow this and we do as you command, that we have a better life waiting for us after this one's over. Father, we pray that you would be with us as we go throughout this study, that we would listen, that we would understand, and that with this knowledge we will be able to better serve you, and also that we would be able to take this to others, and that they would also obey. Father, I pray that you would continue to be with Bobby as he's away from us. Give him a safe journey, and be with us this morning. I ask these things in Christ's name. Amen. In Mark chapter 4, I'm going to read verses 10 and 11. Here it says, But when he was alone, he had been teaching that day. He says, but when he was alone, those around him with the 12 asked him about the parable. And he said to them, to you it has been given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God. But to those who are outside, all things come in parables. He was speaking to his disciples, the 12, and not with a large group of people at this time. And he says, to you that was the ones that were listening to him, that these things were given to them, that they had a better understanding of the gospel at that point. They still didn't understand everything as we see, but they were given more information than those that did not hear. He was quoting from Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah chapter 6, he was prophesying. This is right after Isaiah, actually as Isaiah was coming into the presence of God, and he realizes he's a sinful man, and he is frightened. And an angel comes and touches his lips with this hot coal, and says that your iniquity has been taken away. And then in verse 8 it says, I also heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here am I, send me. And he said, go and tell this people, the Jews, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their hearts, and understand with their and hear with their ears and understand with their heart, and return and be healed. And it says, and then I said to the Lord, how long? And he answered, until the cities are laid waste and without inhabitant, and the houses are without a man, and the land is utterly desolate. The Lord has removed men far away, and the forsaken places, many in the midst of the land. Yet a tenth will be in it, and will return and be for consuming, as a terebinth tree, or as an oak whose stump remains when it is cut down. So the holy seed shall be a stump. Again, quoting from Isaiah, Jesus gives them this, speaks this to them, and he says, in that he talks about perceive. He says, seeing they may see and not perceive. The Hebrew word for perceive is yada. Kind of sounds like yada, but it's yada. It means to know, to ascertain by seeing, to recognize by observation. Also means to discover by seeing, or to have knowledge of something. So seeing, they see, but they don't understand what they're seeing. They hear, but they don't understand what they're hearing. If you see things that happen around you, a lot of times you don't understand what's going on, or you see it, but you don't understand, say, the gravity of the situation. Or you hear something, like my calculus class, you hear something, but you don't understand what you're hearing. That's what was happening. They could see things, they could hear things, but they didn't understand what it was. Again, from Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 through 13, this is a type and an antitype. The type being that the Jews rejected God in the Old Testament. They heard, but from Isaiah, but their hearts were hardened, and because of that, they didn't understand. They already had a perceived way things should be, and what Isaiah was telling them was something they didn't want to hear it. So they had other ideas. They didn't understand the gravity of what Isaiah was telling them. Well, that was the type. They heard, but they didn't understand, so they turned and they rejected what they were hearing. The result of that was they went into a 70-year Babylonian captivity, and so that's what was happening in the Old Testament. The antitype, what that was a parallel to, was that in the New Testament, the Jews rejected Christ. They heard, but they didn't hear because they wanted to learn and understand and then make changes to Judaism. They were trying to find ways that they could challenge Jesus and that they could discredit him for all he was doing. Yes, Dennis.
We have today people similar, what I call honest and dishonest doubters. An honest doubter will say, I doubt that, but if you show them the truth and reason and they're wrong, they'll change their way.
Yeah.
A dishonest doubter will say, I doubt that, because they just want to contend with you and they're never going to change what they think, even if you prove them wrong.
Yeah. Dennis was talking about honest and dishonest doubters today. Those that they doubt something, but when they are shown the proof or the evidence, they say, I was wrong. I'm going to change to conform to this. But then you have the dishonest doubters that say, I'm not buying that. You show them the evidence, but rather than taking that evidence and using it to have a better understanding and to make changes in their lives, they take it and they say, I need to reinforce my position, so I'm not there to make changes in my life. I'm trying to show you where you're wrong. Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate that. So they were trying to challenge his authority. In Mark chapter 12, verses 12 and 13, this is after Jesus gives them another parable. And when they heard this parable, they were not happy because he was basically telling them to explain who they were and that they were wrong. And it says, and these are the religious leaders, and they sought to lay hands on him, but feared the multitude, for they knew he had spoken the parable against them. So they left and went away. And in verse 13 it says, and they sent to him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to catch him in his words. So they weren't there to try to learn. They were there to challenge his authority. And when Jesus was speaking to his disciples, he says that it's given to you this mystery. Or Strong's calls this mystery a divine secret. Vine says this mystery, a mystery as it applies in the New Testament, it says that which is outside the range of unassisted natural apprehension. It means that it's outside the realm of your five senses, and can only be made known by divine revelation. It's given in a manner and at a time appointed by God. Jesus revealed the kingdom to his apostles. At the appointed time, the day of Pentecost, the apostles began to reveal this kingdom to those around them. And today, using the Bible, we reveal the kingdom to those around us by spreading the gospel. And notice that that when the time was right is when this was made known to the apostles and to everyone else. Also, those who were outside, or to those who were outside as he was speaking to his apostles, Strong says that's outside the camp or outside this group. It's not revealed to them in a way that they use it to understand what's going on or what the word is actually, what's actually happening. They use it so they can challenge and attack. Mr. Kaufman writes in his commentary that Jesus cloaked his teachings in parables, which in no sense hid the message from ordinary men and women, people who didn't have an agenda. They being the very ones who fully understood what he was saying. But these parables did, however, fully hide it from the proud, the arrogant, the unspiritual priesthood who organized a cabal against him. You know, I'm not a proud person. I didn't know what a cabal was until when I read this. I got the dictionary, and I had to open it up. A cabal is a conspiratorial group that comes together to plot and to scheme. In this case, they came together to plot and scheme how they were going to trap Jesus in his teachings, how they would be able to accuse him and then finally kill him and take him out of move him from their lives. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 through 10, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 through 10, Peter here says, it's much later, but it's really a continuation of people who are trying to find ways of condemning this gospel. Beginning in verse 7, it says, "Therefore, to you who believe, he is precious," he being Jesus is precious, "but to those who are disobedient or disbelieve," he again quotes and says, "the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble being disobedient to the word to which they were appointed. But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy." These are those kind of people. He's saying that the average person in those days understood. Wayne Jackson says, God laid the cornerstone, Jesus, in Jerusalem, and the Jews rejected him by and large. Really, not only the leaders, but a large group of the Jews rejected him. And to the Gentiles who were, that we see the word being taken to, if you look at Paul's sermon on Mars Hill, this message was scoffed at because of the simplicity of the message. These sophisticated and intellectual Gentiles of that day, those who were supposed to be the cream of the crop, they tended to reject the teachings because it was just too simple. They just couldn't get past the fact that of this message. So they also condemned. These were the people that were on the outside of this message. They heard it, but they didn't understand it, and they could see things, but they still didn't understand as well. Did you have a question?
Today, certain denominations will tell you that the message that the Church of Christ preaches, that plain Christians preach,
Yeah. It's attainable by everybody is what he's looking for. Sandy's saying that there are those that would say this message today is too simple. There's got to be things added to it because it's just God wouldn't do that. He wants more. And they're saying that the gospel we preach and we teach other people is just too simplistic. There must be more to it. And so they add things to it, which is not what God expected of us. And then we switch over in chapter 4, talking about spreading the gospel. You know, we spent all last week learning how to take the gospel to other people. And Rob Whitaker did a great job of presenting a method to us that's simple, that's easy for people to understand, and it's not something you have to go and memorize a lot of things. All you do is sit down and you let the Bible speak and do the work. And there really is three parts to this section: is sowing the seed, growing the seed, and also talking about the mustard seed. Talk about spreading the gospel. In fact, Rob was talking about it's not really spreading; it's planting. Planting seeds is what should be the idea we get from this part of it. In Matthew chapter 4, verses 3 through 9, this is prior to what Jesus said to his apostles later on, after he goes into this part. That's why they had the questions about the parables. In Mark chapter 4, verses 3 through 9, this is what we know as the parable of the sower. Here it says, "And again, he began to teach by the sea, and a great multitude was gathered." I'm starting at verse 1. "And a great multitude was gathered to him, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea, and the whole multitude was on the land facing the sea. And he taught them many things by parables, and said to them in his teaching, 'Listen, behold, a sower went out to sow. And it happened as he sowed that some of the seed fell by the wayside, and the birds of the air came and devoured it. Some fell on the stony ground, where it did not have much earth. And immediately it sprang up, because it had no depth of earth. And when the sun was up, and it was scorched, and because it had no root, it withered away. And some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no crop. But the other seed fell on the good ground, and yielded a crop that sprang up, increased, and produced some 30-fold, some 60, and some 100. And he said to them, 'He who has ears, let him hear.'" So we see, as we remember what Rob was saying, he said that we plant, we don't pick. What that means is you go and you spread the word. And the Bible will do the picking for you. You don't have to. Those who want to hear, they're going to hear. Those who don't, they're going to let you know that they don't want to hear. You don't have to try to be the one that says, "Well, I'm going to go take the gospel of this person, but not this person." Take it to all of them, and they will let you know where their heart is. You don't have to do that. He says the Bible will do that for you. Also in Matthew chapter 24, Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30, we learned that Satan is really working hard to choke out the good seed from hearing this word and actually becoming followers of it. Let's go back to Mark chapter 4, verses 13 through 20. And this is where Jesus explains parable to his disciples that are sitting around him. And he said to them, "Do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables?" So even those that were his closest associates didn't have a full understanding of what he was teaching in these parables. And then he says, "The sower sows the word, and those are on, and these are the ones by the wayside, where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan comes immediately and takes away the word that was sown in their hearts. These likewise are the ones sown on the thorny ground. When they hear the word, immediately receive it with gladness. And they have no roots in themselves, and so endure only for a time. Afterward, when tribulation or persecution arises, for the word's sake, immediately they stumble. Now these are the ones sown among thorns. They are the ones who hear the word, and the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, and the desires of other things entering in, choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. But these are the ones sown on good ground, those who hear the word, accept it, and bear fruit, some 30-fold, some 60, and some 100. So here Jesus explains this parable to his apostles, or to his disciples. And he says there's basically 4 different kinds of seed, or he gives 4 different kinds of people, hearts, that are going to be hearing this word. If you think about a sower in those days, a person would have a basket, generally, full of seed. And they would walk the rows, and they would be, if they were sowing wheat, they would throw this seed out. Not all the seed landed where it was intended to land, because some of it, as it's being thrown, would end up being on the road where it's really hard. It's never going to grow. Now, it can't even get in the ground. And then there's some that are going to fall over to the edge of the road that there's some soil there, but it's still pretty hard. And then there's others that, on the edges of fields, you'll see a lot of weeds and things. And the seed that falls there is going to have a really hard time to grow. And then then you have the area where you intended it to go, or where the planter was looking for it to go, and it's the good ground. And once that seed is planted there, it actually causes growth. So we're looking at 4 different kinds of ground here, and the ground being the hearts of those where the seed is planted. You have those that immediately it was taken away. That's the wayside seed. And then you have those that fall in the thorns, can't even read, in the stony ground. They have no root in themselves. And as soon as they start to grow, as soon as the sun comes up, it scorches them, and they fall away. And then there's those that fall into thorny ground, or the seed that falls in thorny ground, where as soon as it starts growing, the weeds are growing up with it, and it takes all the nutrients, and it ends up dying as well. And then the good seed. So it gives these 4 different comparisons, and each one of these is a different kind of heart. There are those, you're not going to listen. They're going to hear it. They're not even going to pay attention to it. There are those who are going to hear it. They're going to accept it, but they're going to fall away pretty quickly. And I've seen those. We actually, years ago, had someone in a place I used to go where we had a campaign. We baptized some people, and within a month or 2, 3 or 4 of those people were gone and had already fallen away. So that's the ones that it's really hard for them to find a way of growing once they hear the word and accept it. Then there are those that hear the word, and as soon as they hear it, or that they accept it, But then life happens. Things start happening. Sometimes it gets hard. And when Sandy was saying earlier about it's too easy. Christian life is not an easy life, because you end up with a lot of things that either you have to give up because you don't live that way anymore. You may have to give up friendships. You may have to give up some family. There's a lot of things you give up because of that. And so sometimes people would rather have those things than actually live according to the gospel. But then and they fall away. But then there are those who hear it, they become fruitful, and they spend their entire lives following after Christ and being fruitful in his kingdom. Mark chapter 4, verses 26 through 29, we see a parable. This is the only place that this parable is given. None of the other gospel accounts give this. Matthew chapter 4, verses 26 through 29, it says, And he said, the kingdom of God is as if a man should scatter seed on the ground, and should sleep by night and rise by day, and the seed should sprout and grow. He himself does not know how. But the earth yields crops by itself. First the blade, then the head after that, and the full grain in the head. But when the grain ripens, immediately he puts in the sickle, because the harvest has come. So here we see that in this parable, we see a person who spreads the word. And the word sprouts in this person. The person that's actually spreading this word is not the one that is doing the work on this person's heart. It's the word itself. The seed is planted in them. I don't know how seeds sprout. You can take seeds that have been they're several years old that you can plant. They still have, and then somehow they still sprout. I don't know how. It's not work I do, even though I may put some water on them and put them in the ground. It's not me that's doing that work on them. It's not us that's doing the work on these people that we take the gospel to. It's the word itself. And God will give the increase on that. So we see it. Sometimes it starts very slow. Sometimes it's taken immediately. And eventually, this word in this person's heart makes them change and become Christians as well. And you have the harvest. Okay. He also talks about the mustard seed. He said the seed, this is in Mark chapter 30, verses 30 through 32. As he continues, he says, Then he said, To what shall, or with what parable shall we pick greater than all the herbs and shoots out large branches so that the birds of the air may nest under its shade. So here Jesus is talking about the kingdom, starting very tiny with this mustard seed. Mustard seed is tiny. Let's see if I have a picture of that. It's not advancing. If you look up at the very top center, there's this mustard seed. This is a person's finger. This mustard seed is just absolutely tiny. Jesus is saying this is the way the kingdom is going to be. It's going to start out small. 12 guys that Jesus taught. It started out small. Jesus taught these men, and on the day of Pentecost, the church started out again small, with 3,000 people, but that's still fairly small. But look what it developed into, this huge kingdom that started on the day of Pentecost. It started out small, but has grown and matured into what we see today. Yes, ma'am.
I have been told by people who raise these things that that little thing right there is a seed pod, and that there are over 10,000 seeds in that itty bitty thing.
Really? 10,000?
So
Yeah.
it's like smaller than a grain of sand.
Oh,
It's practically invisible to the naked eye. And people who use these cut them because the outer part is hard so that they have more seed to plant. So I have no idea, but I mean, if you're talking a tiny seed,
yeah.
pretty tiny.
Yeah, Sandy's saying that this is actually a seed pod, and that this seed pod can contain up to 10,000 actual seeds inside of it. That's a lot of that's a lot of seeds in a really tiny spot. Thank you so much for that. So we see that the kingdom starting out small and growing to maturity to become very large. Again, teaching about the kingdom, Jesus speaking to his disciples, said in Mark chapter 2 and verse 21 and 22, he says, "No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, or else the new piece pulls away from the old, and the tear is made worse. No one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine bursts the wineskin, and the wine is spilled, and the wineskins are ruined. But new wine must be put in new wineskins." Here Jesus is talking about, in the first part, that Judaism can't be patched. Christianity was not a Band-Aid to fix the things that were, to fix the problems they were having with the old law. That wasn't the case at all. Jesus is saying, this is something completely new. And this is not an attempt to fix this old law. He came to fulfill the law and set new rules in place. It was a complete replacement of the law of Moses. Mr. Kaufman also says of this, he says, Jesus' teachings were not subordinate to the ordinances of Judaism, or they weren't made to fall under the law of Moses. These were completely different. And he talks about this new wine, these new wineskins. And he says this is not an attempt, again, to come up with something that is a sect of Judaism. This is something completely different. Christianity is not Judaism. And when he was teaching his apostles, that's what he was trying to explain to them, that this was going to be something completely different. Yes.
Jesus' teachings go beyond Judaism.
Yes.
Go to the Sermon on the Mount. He says things like, "You've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder." He goes beyond that and says, well, even if you're angry with your brother. So he basically takes it from an external act to your heart. So
Yeah.
it goes beyond Judaism.
Yeah, absolutely does. You remember Rob said that 9 of the 10 commandments from the law of Moses were also brought into the law that we live under today. But if you look at in fact, my father used to always tell me that If you live by the 10 Commandments, you're doing good. You're okay. Well, that's not right, because if you start looking at it and you look at what Jesus taught, you'll fall far short of what Jesus commands if you look at the Old Testament or the 10 Commandments. There was actually a much higher requirements on what he teaches than what the 10 Commandments taught. But thank you, Dennis. Again, he talked about the kingdom, and he talks about those that were watching him or listening to him. When he, in Mark chapter 3, verse 27, he had healed. Let's see, where am I? He had cast out demons, and he was being criticized about this, and they were saying that it was, they were trying to figure out something to accuse him with. And then they say that he was, let's start with verse 20. He said, then the multitudes came together again so that they could not so much as eat bread. But when his own people heard about this, they went out to lay hold of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, he has Beelzebub, and by the ruler of the demons he casts out demons. So he called them to himself and said to them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, the kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but has an end. And no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man, and then he will plunder his house. So here they're trying to say that Jesus, in doing this miracle of casting out this demon, was doing this by the power of Satan. He's saying, Satan, Satan doesn't do things that are contrary to what Satan wants to do. Casting out a demon is having a demon in someone is what Satan would prefer. Casting him out is not something he would do. And he's trying to say that you sound like you're a divided house. Divided house can't stand. Okay. We had a whole other section I didn't get to. Thank you so much for your attendance this morning.